and saying, gee, that's worth $250,000 IR&D investment. Why don't we see what happens? So when you look at agriculture and pharmaceuticals and new materials and things like that, you're really starting to see a demand pull from every other economic sector. And I think that is going to be a powerhouse creation for new innovative ideas in the space economy.
From the Defense and Aerospace Report, this is The Downlink, a podcast about the intersection of space, the space business, and defense. Not just what's over the horizon, but what's happening above it. I'm your host, Laura Winter. Well before SpaceX, nerds knew that space was cool. But being nerdtastic does not mean conversion into capital or even investment interest. But that is changing fast. In this week's episode, we're hearing from Kevin O'Connell. If you don't know his name, you should. He's a former director of the Office of Space Commerce at the U.S. Department of Commerce. He is the founder and chief executive of Space Economy Rising. It's a strategic advisory firm that counts commercial space companies, technology firms, and private capital investors as clients. It's his business to identify the trends, understand the pressure points like regulations, and spot the opportunities. Kevin says the space sector is about much more than exploration, and that the demand for access to space is now coming from a variety of industrial sectors, such as agriculture and energy, even healthcare. Many investors in both the private and public markets are rightly entranced by the SpaceX IPO story because, well, it's a gift that keeps on giving. Since regular trading began on Monday, its market cap has risen well above the $2.5 trillion mark. In fact, it is in a competition of sorts with Amazon to be number 5 in the global market capitalization rankings. NVIDIA, the AI chip designer, is the most valuable company with a market cap of more than $5 trillion. But here's what the IPO really revealed. It didn't create demand for space investment opportunities. It confirmed what family offices and sovereign wealth funds already knew, that the hunger for space as an asset class has been building for years. And now the rest of the world is paying attention. What the SpaceX IPO also shows is that the infrastructure of space is maturing. Launch is now affordable, and that creates an opportunity for others to ask, what can space do for me? The demand pull, as my guest today would say, is coming from everywhere. Here's my conversation with Kevin. Hey, Kevin, thank you so much for making the time to come on the Downlink podcast.
Thanks, Laura, for having me today. Nice to be back here.
Kevin, you are one of those special people in my life who has a resume as long as my leg, and I'm kind of tall. And you've held positions in and out of government for years. And now you are a jet-setting man of mystery. But all kidding aside, you're quite a serious player in the space sector and have been for years. So please, could you take a moment and tell us, what you're doing right now and where you're doing it? I mean, you seem to be on the board of quite a few space companies or on board a plane jetting off to somewhere far away to talk about space. So yeah, what are you doing?
Sure. Thanks very much for the kind words. Well, hi, everyone. I'm Kevin O'Connell. I'm currently the CEO of Space Economy Rising, which is a Washington advisory firm. So I spend a lot of time on advisory boards and boards. I'm also on the board of directors of the Space Foundation and the U.S. Geospatial Intelligence Foundation. Do a lot of international work as well, as Laura has suggested, really talking to folks about the space economy. Of course, I was formerly the director of space commerce in the first Trump administration, and that followed about 3 decades of work in one place or another on space commerce and space commercialization.
And defense too, right?
Absolutely. The security aspects of what's happening in space commerce.
So, Kevin, many of us are still waiting and watching for what effects the SpaceX IPO will have on the public markets, the availability of public market capital for the space sector, and what about private and institutional capital? And we're going to get to that a little bit later. But first, let's just get you on your take of the broader space economy. And I also wonder if inflation has any effect at all, right? I mean, it did just breach 4% for May here in the United States. I'm sure the rest of the world is also contending with similar rises. So you have to wonder, where is the subsector that space is? Where is the space economy going?
Sure. So thank you. So first and foremost, it's a very exciting time in the space community, as you've already mentioned. I would say that for all the political changes we're seeing going on around the world, the one thing that I see is universal interest in doing more in space. Obviously, on the one hand, folks ranging from Ottawa to Berlin to Tokyo, as well as in the United States, of course, are spending substantially more money on space domain awareness, space defense related issues. But I think we're also at a point where people see that space is moving beyond exploration. And there's still plenty to explore, by the way, when I say that, into an area which is going to create enormous economic value. And I think that's the top line that I would see on the space economy right now.
So when you said substantial, I've got to ask you, what is that? Like, what is that measured in? I mean, are we talking hundreds of millions of dollars? Is that substantial, or are we talking something bigger or smaller?
No, I think we're talking about something much bigger. I have often said publicly that I think that we could, in our lifetime, see economic benefit to folks here on Earth, obviously, that it rivals economic benefit that we've seen through much of history, and so that's a large number. I would also caution, though, that when I say that, it's not automatic. There are a lot of issues that we will have to make sure work properly to do that. One of the things that we're talking about right now is to make sure that the space economy moves from an asset economy, a place where we build things, to what's really a fully functioning space economy, that creates enormous economic impact. So I think it's a large number. By the way, Laura, I didn't answer your question, but on the inflation issue, we know for a fact, and you can look back 4 or 5 years on this, we know for a fact that this sector, like every other sector, is affected by inflation, macroeconomic trends, things like that. So obviously there's an effect. I think that effect right now is dwarfed by the excitement that we're seeing in the space community. And that's not just the SpaceX IPO, that's a big part of it. But we're also seeing other kinds of economic activity where founders are now, they're merging, they're going public either directly or, through a SPAC process. And so we're seeing a lot of other economic activity that give reason for optimism here.
But also, isn't this kind of becoming a wee bit of a tiered economy? Because over the past number of years, right, there's was a huge focus on new space and on those startups. I mean, you just mentioned founders and founders wanting to go public. They were known for new technology, agility, ecosystem building. But I feel like the winds kind of favor the contracts, right? They're still going to the primes. And so I feel like the economy is, or the space economy very specifically, is still very much dominated by very large established companies. And if they haven't been around for for 5 decades or so, that they have a lot of capital. They're big caps, right?
So
Whether they're public or private. So what happens to the rest of everybody else though, right?
Sure. So this is a great question because this is actually a topic that we've been talking a lot about, writing about recently, which is there's a phenomenon. This mostly happened as the space world swung hard toward defense over the last 4 or 5 years. Okay, on the one hand, we see a lot of investment in very predictable areas, large contracts, places where the government is spending money, and the government is spending, as are other governments, unprecedented amounts of money on space defense and space security related issues. Okay, there's the similar amount of investment on the other end of the spectrum, though, the very early stage, need to get 250K, need to get $500,000 kind of thing. What's lacking is the middle. And I think one of the things we're thinking about as we approach the SpaceX IPO is the need to make sure that the entire spectrum of space activities is funded, is capitalized, and so remain to be seen. Now, again, there's a lot of cash flowing into the system, and again, there's also a lot of funding coming in from governments into the system, and they work synergistically together in an ideal setting. And so, the extent to which those new dollars fill out this spectrum of capability, I think we will have a potential for a fully functioning economy, space economy.
All right. And you know that this is a short kind of a podcast. So I'm going to kind of, nudge you along here. But I really do want to get after something that I know really sticks in your craw, right? And that's regulations.
Sure.
You worked on this when you were in government, you've worked on it when you're out of government. It's not going to go away. And while it's true that this administration wants to reduce regulation, other parts of the world may not exactly agree with that approach. So, starting locally here in the United States, what what has been the win or the loss? And I'm going to ask you to try and be kind of narrow in creating a better environment for the space economy vis-a-vis regulations, just here in the United States.
So let me just make a quick comment generally about regulation. Space is one of the most regulated businesses on Earth, and I would say that everyone is trying to understand what the right level of regulation is. So whether you're a mature power, we'll talk about the United States and Europe and Japan, or whether you're an emerging space player, African countries, some Middle East countries, everyone is trying to understand what the right level of regulation will be. So that's the general point. On the specifics in the United States, obviously we've now had, in addition to many other things, we've had 2 executive orders out of the administration, and very important to read the words on paper. Everything from reform of the launch regulations to plans to get back to the moon with astronauts by 28, a lunar base by 2030 or the start of that, the move to put a nuclear reactor on the moon. These are all critical to the lunar economy. If we don't have nuclear power and propulsion, for example, you have a very small economy. You need that kind of energy to move forward. So in the executive orders, you see a lot of intent in different areas. You see a need to understand what's going on in space from very low Earth orbit all the way out to cislunar. By the way, there's a very interesting newfound focus on cislunar space, which we should pay attention to. And so I think in the spirit of regulatory reform that we started in the first Trump administration, we still see an attempt to make sure that the entrepreneur is given a balance in addition to the normal protection of safety and security that is out there. The concept of mission authorization, of course, was given to commerce. That's something that we lobbied for very hard in the past. And the idea there is to essentially create one place where an entrepreneur can come to get consideration of a new idea. The problem we have is that in law, the only things that are currently regulated are communications, remote sensing, and launch. And yet so many entrepreneurs are coming forward with ideas in so many different areas that they need a more efficient way to actually have those considered for regulation. And that's been a challenge in the past. So many people are coming. Remember, when the government regulated those 3 areas currently regulated in law, they've been doing them for decades. And so in many new areas, we can look at space medicine, we can look at, a whole host of other new functions coming in. The government doesn't necessarily have an advantage in knowing a lot more than industry does, and the scale and speed of what industry is investing in these areas is enormous. And I know we'll get to the space AI combination, if not during the SpaceX part of the conversation, then elsewhere.
And so, as I said, other nations have been or are working on regulations that can both help or hinder space companies, and not just U.S. companies, but all space companies. Uh, The menu is short, though, for what to choose from, but they are consequential. We've got the seemingly unpopular EU Space Act. There was a revision. I believe it came out in May, but the most unpopular, perhaps most expensive parts of that draft legislation are still in, and that's one. And the second menu item is coming out of Japan. The government approved a bill in March that would fundamentally shift how Japan regulates launches, moving from a framework built around satellites to one built around the rocket itself. Now, regardless of what's on board, the audience should bear in mind that while the Japanese government may approve a bill, it's actually the parliament, the Diet in Japan, that has to vote on it before it becomes a law. So that's still in process as well. So for time, unfortunately, I am going to ask you to choose one, right? Which one catches your eye, or which one catches your ire the most?
Well, so I think they're all very interesting, and they speak to my more general point that everybody's looking for the right way to do this. I think with the case of Europe, I've written about this in the past. The first shot at the European Space Act we thought was potentially injurious to entrepreneurs. I think a lot of people felt that same way, and there's been this attempt at rewrite, as you've just suggested. There's no doubt, based on a litany of white papers, the Draghi report, the UNISTO report on European defense. There's no doubt that Europe is trying to move forward after decades of what was a politically acceptable but economically inefficient approach to funding space. And so they're working very hard to do that. It's part of the burden sharing story. It's part of the space sovereignty story. There's no doubt that they need to have a single market or need to act as a single market, but they're always tempted to regulate in a way that really fails to let European industry flourish in this particular space. And so I think that's the trade-off that's underway right now. That's the thing people are talking about. When you look at the most recent review of the European Space Act, you see mostly entrepreneurs arguing that they're going to be left less competitive because of everything from administrative requirements to insurance requirements to space debris requirements.
But just speaking of the administrative requirements, I really do want to jump in here because, people think of regulations as just these words on paper or now digitally, right? They don't really see what the cost is. But just to sign up, just to get your foot in the door, I mean, we are talking about what, $100,000 for space companies on the low end just to open the door to becoming compliant. Am I wrong about that?
You mean you talking about in Europe or in the United States?
In Europe.
When Europe, there are substantial fees associated with it.
Yes, the fees. The fees are really big.
And it's not just the fees, it's the process. It's the, if you will, the due process that people have to go through. We could do an entire show on regulation. Remember that good regulation is agile, is flexible, consistent with market conditions, and most importantly, it's transparent to all parties. And that's easy for me to say, and it's very hard for governments to do. And so administrative requirements are everything from fees. We have a discussion underway in the States now about pay for service. Certainly in the launch industry, we have a pay for service discussion at Commerce on tracks and the space safety function. That's just one part of it. Insurance is another part. There's many different mechanisms. Regulators, when we talk about space innovations, regulators sometimes get nervous and say, oops, that's exciting, but we have to think about that and we'll get back to you. The problem in this market, this global market, is that things are moving so fast that we're going to get back to you and we're going to think about and get back to you, could put companies out of business. And we've seen that happen before, especially when things are brand new. They're unprecedented in the market. Some of the things related to mining in space and space nuclear power and energy from space and other ideas are out there like that. They do have to be thought through, but they have to be thought through in an efficient way. And as we often had said before and still say, in a regulatory process, we hope there's a presumption of approval for the entrepreneur to try what they do. There may be guardrails that are imposed, but there's a presumption of approval that they're going to try it rather than them dwelling in a endless conversation about why they shouldn't be done.
And the fees. And
Well,
make
again,
and
fees
right,
are a whole
and
other
make the
part.
fees
Again,
appropriate to the
no, no,
size
I've
of the
often argued
company.
against fees as well. I've never known governments that collect fees to collect fewer fees, or you know, and so I don't know that the number is $100,000, but it's a substantial
It's
fee, and
substantial. I
y-
remember it is substantial.
yeah,
But just with everything that we've just been talking about, right? It's regulations, and at the end of the day, it's about how space companies may be required to invest money to gain access to those markets. So let's talk about money and let's talk about capital sources, because you
sure.
advise a number of investors of all shapes and sizes. What are the trends that you are seeing in capital, in the availability of capital? Is there more capital available in the private markets? We know that there's capital. These people think that there's capital available in the public markets. We'll as we have just said, we'll be kind of getting into that a little bit later. But yeah, is there less capital? Is it harder to get capital? What's going on?
So again, a topic we could talk a lot about. Let me make a couple of general statements. First of all, government funding and private capital are key, and they're best when they work together. Now, there's in the United States, there's on the civil side, there's less capital than there has been on the national security side. There'll be substantially more, and that will have its own nuances. But in general, government funding and private capital work well together. I have always argued, though, that private capital, and never forget that when I was at Commerce, we spent a lot of time on this. Private capital tends to fuel innovation because it thinks about risk differently than the way the government thinks about it. And it seeks differentiation between ideas. And so if I say I want to create a company just like Laura's company, an investor will say, well, why would I give you a dime for that? You either need to create a different company or a better company than Laura has. And that's what really fuels innovation. And of course, we're seeing the exceptional example here in the SpaceX case, and then the related discussions about orbital data centers and a number of other things that are going on. So capital here is very, very important. I would also say this: when we look back to the 2021 period, the period in which SPACs were very popular. And it was really early enthusiasm, early private capital enthusiasm in the space business, at least this go around. And what happened at the time, I think, were two things. Number one, investors were not yet savvy enough about what makes a successful space company. And secondly, entrepreneurs did not recognize that they needed to be very comfortable in understanding what unit cost economics meant. Space entrepreneurs would often say, let's talk about the technology. And I've sat on many, many, many investor calls in which entrepreneurs say, let's talk about the technology. And the investor really wants to talk about who are your customers, what are your pipeline, what's your pipeline look like, what are your unit cost economics look like. And the entrepreneur at the time would say, let's go talk about my technology again. And the investor would say,
Right.
hey, I'm sorry, I don't understand what you're talking about, or you're not focused enough on how you're actually going to make money for us.
Uh,
I think we're
oh,
in a
but
different place.
Kevin, this still happens today.
No, of course it is. I think it happens. I think it does not happen as much on both sides. I think investors are more savvy. Okay. We could invoke the famous philosopher Yogi Berra, when thinking about the future, but I think investors are more savvy today about what makes a successful space company. They're seeing the government commitments backing things. This administration is committed to longer term contracts and new entrants and things like that. But I think entrepreneurs are also now smarter about the economics of their business because they've learned sometimes the hard way that it's the only way they're going to get funded by private entities.
So let's talk about really big money, big checks, big check writers, right?
Sure.
And I know that you speak to a lot of folks overseas who want a big piece of the future. But I don't think that it is well understood how sovereign wealth funds invest in space. And that's big, big, big money, like bigger than adult money.
Sure.
I can think of at least two that have invested in SpaceX before the IPO, but that was through an AI vehicle. So it was kind of weird. That's Qatar Investment Authority and MGX, which is the UAE's fund that includes Mubadala Investment Company. And that is the sovereign wealth fund there. And the partner there was G42, or is rather. They all invested in XAI a month before it was bought by SpaceX. The Qataris are also invested in Axiom Space. And there's more. But who are the real sovereign wealth fund players in the space sector? What do they want? What's the play that they're looking for? What boxes have to be checked for them so that they will open their wallets?
So the starting point is that within existing government budgets, governments are spending more than ever. We didn't talk yet about Japan. Japan has become the third largest spender on space in the world. They're living in a tough neighborhood. They see the economic benefits of investing in space. And so the government is making a substantial investment in space, both on the national security side, but also in the Japanese space agency's Space Strategy Fund. And so the starting point here is the recognition that governments are investing in space in a very heavy way. Budgets are broken through in Europe, obviously in Germany specifically.
But these aren't just contracts; these are investments.
Well, so
Right.
absolutely.
This is a different funding vehicle. I mean, Germany's Credit Institute for Reconstruction, and it's also known as KfW. It's actually a bank, so it's not a sovereign wealth fund, but it just invested again earlier this month in ISAR Aerospace in their Series D round. So, yeah, I mean,
So I think the sovereign wealth funds really have taken note, number one, of the importance of space security really around the world, the emergence of sovereign space interests. And so they're very much investing on that basis under an expectation that governments want to use space security, space domain awareness related capabilities because they're important for the small end national security in the particular context. And so that's always been the case since, really dating back to the first Gulf War. Sovereign wealth funds started to pay attention to the fact that this was an important area to shape, to participate in as an investment tool, not just a funding tool.
but I guess what I find odd, I mean, from what you've just said, I mean, yes, of course they're interested in investing in things that will protect their nation, which you can see that with the KfW play in Germany into a German company for German purposes. But there are sovereign wealth funds that are investing in non same nation businesses, right? I
And
mean, Qataris
overseas
and
business.
overseas. I mean, the
Yeah.
Qataris invested in SpaceX, and we see SpaceX and it's Space Launch or XAI, but that's what they invested in originally. But we see SpaceX as a sovereign technology capability, right? That's ours. That's United States, but it's got Qatari money in it. So that's what I mean. You have these sovereign wealth funds funding things that are outside of their borders.
So they're partly trying to understand how the technology is working. They're partly doing it for pure investment purposes. There's certainly a set of rules that govern anything that touches national security that have to be complied with, CFIUS and other things. At least in the U.S. case, other countries have similar rules, et cetera. So there's a multiple set of reasons why the sovereigns are starting to invest in these technologies, understand them, perhaps leverage them for their own national purpose under the right rule set. So it's very natural to me that these investments are being made.
Which goes kind of contrary to what some people are saying. I read, I think it was yesterday or the day before in the Wall Street Journal, that there is a scarcity of capital, right? And it's like I'm kind of confused here. because there seems to be actually quite a bit of capital out there. But they said that there is a scarcity of capital due to competition with AI and amongst AI companies and other deep tech sectors that are, gaining ground. And so when you think about space has to compete for similar dollars or similar available capital. But is there actually a scarcity of capital, or are people just not looking in the right place, or, maybe the report was just wrong?
No, I don't know. It depends on what you mean by scarcity. In
Right,
some sense,
exactly.
there are banks that regularly, credible banks that regularly assess the amount of, I'll call it excess or on the shelf capital that is out there.
Dry powder.
There's no question that the SpaceX IPO, the Anthropic IPO, those are going to dent those numbers very heavily, but there is a lot of capital that is out there. Now, if we saw 10 or 12 of these things, would that start to put a serious dent? Certainly it could. But the market will soon shake out, who are the most valuable of these companies and who are not as valuable, and they will act accordingly. They take money back out of companies that don't succeed. And the comparisons are very hard. When we look at SpaceX, we see the Starlink part of the business, we see the launch part of the business, and then what is really driving their investments, a ferociously competitive global AI business. And so, there's always a question: is SpaceX still a space company? Is it an AI company? I think
Well,
that's
they've said it in their S1, right? I
right.
mean,
We,
it's
we
three.
can
It's got three segments. It's got the space
right.
launch segment. It's got the Starlink segment, which they call communications, and then there's the AI segment, which includes Grok and Colossus and the social media company X, right? So
But
I don't
I
know.
think
Are
there's
they a
plenty of
space
money for
company?
now. Let's we'll have to see how things play out. But again, if companies don't perform, money will come back out of those companies. It's very natural the way the market operates.
Well, when you talk to folks overseas and some of the big check writers, or at least you do speak with them, right? What are they actually interested in? What are the right places for their bets? I mean, launch infrastructure, people are talking about it. People have been talking about it for years, but we are seeing a real crunch in the sense that there's just not enough launch and not enough launch places to launch from, right? So that's got to be the top one or two, because without launch, nothing happens. At least that's what Dr. Wu, the head of the Taiwanese Space Agency, told me a couple of weeks ago. And I'm saying that to you because I know that is a soft spot for you in your heart there.
Absolutely. So, as countries
But
are
yeah,
pursuing their own sovereign capabilities, one of the ones they're seeing is the need to invest in launch, and so we're probably going to see regional launch winners, if you will. Some people will continue to make use of the massive capability here that SpaceX will bring in the market, ideally at some point soon, Blue Origin and other U.S. providers, Rocket Lab in New Zealand. So on the general point, we still have a deficiency of launch right now that has to be corrected. It's one of the absolute necessities to get into space is you need launch capability. That's pretty simple. But so I think launch is an area of focus for a lot of people. You can see that by virtue of the number of companies that are in the market that say they're in the launch business. I've run panels in the past few years in which there were allegedly 200 companies in the small sat launch business. Well, that doesn't last very long because no matter how much demand there is, there's not enough demand for that many companies. And not all of them were 100% anchored in real activities, et cetera. They were mostly ideas and visions and things like that. That's one. Certainly, anything related, we can use the term dual use. Again, debate that ad nauseum about what it means. We see a lot of interest in sensing, both looking down as well as looking up. Improving our understanding what's happening here on Earth. That is a place where, by the way, artificial intelligence has really, we hear people talk about it with regard to space generally. And it's going to come in all those areas. But the place we've already seen an impact is in what we'll call the geospatial intelligence area. The ability to sort through massive amounts of data, different kinds of data, and actually develop some insights based on that. Also, looking up again, the part of the space domain awareness, space situational awareness, military civil, the way I've said it, is a much deeper understanding of what's going on in space. So that's attracting a lot of attention right now from the investment community. And then even lunar capabilities. Again, the administration has accelerated the return directly to the moon and the lunar base, as I said earlier. And so we're starting to see everything from investment in commercial space stations. In fact, if I'm remembering correctly, well over $1 billion was invested within the last couple of months in some of the commercial space stations, but also things that are going to the moon. The landers and the rovers. Remember that we're going to need all of the infrastructure that we have here on Earth to effectively create a lunar economy, comms, sensing, SSA, things like that. So we often do a disservice when we talk about the space economy because we talk about it at this giant macro level. Everybody cites the $1.8 trillion, that came out of the World Economic Forum. I think the number is actually substantially larger. But what we really need to do is you need to dive into different verticals. There are some old-fashioned ones, if you will, SATCOM, weather, sensing, navigation, and even the old-fashioned ones are moving at lightning speed. They're changing by virtue of technologies. Then there are people that are inventing lunar landers. There are people that are inventing, lunar mining and the ways to do in-space manufacturing and space medicine and things like that. And so the whole sector is really moving at a rapid pace. They're able to leverage technologies from adjacencies all over the place. I think that's one of the strengths in the space economy. They're able to benefit from adjacent technology developments. So we know AI, quantum, digital Earth models, things like that are really fueling what's happening. The other thing I'd say, and the reason I'm always very optimistic, is that this used to be a push business only. The space community would invent something and say, hey, they're government, you take it, you figure out what to do with it. It's a very different world now because what we're seeing is literally every other economic sector is actually drawing upon ideas. It's drawing upon the easier access to space and saying, gee, that's worth $250,000 IR&D investment. Why don't we see what happens? So when you look at agriculture and pharmaceuticals and new materials and things like that, you're really starting to see a demand pull from every other economic sector. And I think that is going to be a powerhouse creation for new innovative ideas in the space economy.
Now, we are really running out of time. Okay. So this one is going to have to be short and sweet. So I challenge you. I challenge you to be efficient. But as I promised up at the top, I want to know what you think about the effects of the SpaceX IPO. What is it going to be in the long term? Not this week, not this month or a quarter, but say a year after this IPO. What does the world look like for the space sector once the dust settles? Or maybe the dust doesn't even settle, right? Are there going to be unintended consequences that we should be aware of?
So I think the dust doesn't settle necessarily because there's going to be so much positive change going forward that you're going to see dust in all sorts of places. Remember, we're not only seeing SpaceX, that's the exceptional example, but we're seeing a lot of other activities as well. And so I think we're going to see progress on multiple fronts. We're going to head back to the moon. We're going to get back there with a permanent presence. And by the way, you have to do things very differently when you're there permanently than when you went for 5 days. There's a lot of human factor things that have to be done. And so that will all generate a whole new set of ideas from non-traditional space sectors, I would say. I think you're also going to see, I talked earlier about the structural challenges, where money is being spent presently. And I think what you're going to see is you're going to see some of that fill in. You're going to see the large amounts of capital will fill in the supply chain that the space companies will need. So they'll strengthen the supply chain. They'll also make They'll also make investments in new ideas. So again, whether you're a believer or not in orbital data centers, what Musk has said is that he will use the orbital data centers he builds mostly for his own businesses to start. So in essence, creating his own ecosystem. He'll either prove or disprove the idea, but you'll see a lot of energy placed there. Unintended consequences.
From this IPO. Yeah.
Well, from the IPO, I think you're just going to see, another example of a company that has got tremendous capability. We do want to see competition in the market, obviously. And so, we cannot quibble that SpaceX has lifted, the overwhelming majority of mass to orbit in the last few years. We do want to see competition in this space for the whole variety of things that people are going to want to do. That's important in defense. It always has been. And so I think you'll see that. I think another unintended consequence is you're going to see lots of people who are newfound millionaires that will also, and maybe this is not an unintended consequence, it's an intended.
I don't think it is. Yeah. I think that's very much intended.
They earned it. So, they will also play a role. And unlike the past, when I talked about investor, I won't say ignorance is too strong, but, investor being uncertain about an idea, many of these people will be people with strong technical engineering background to say, hey, you really can't deliver that new capability in 3 years. We know it's going to take 10, but we're willing to invest in it for 10. And so I think that's a positive consequence that will come out of the IPO, obviously. When companies go into the public markets, they're going to have to perform, or the market will deal them back what's deserved when they can't perform to their expectations.
Kevin, we have run out of time. So thank you so much for making the time to come on the podcast.
Laura, my pleasure as always, and nice to see you, and hope we see you again soon.
Oh, you bet.
Thanks, everybody.
That's it for this week. For your daily dose of award-winning defense coverage, listen to the Defense and Aerospace Report with Vago Muradian. And for the maritime domain, listen to Cavis Ships with Chris Cavis and Chris Cervello, and get your air domain news and analysis from the Air Power Podcast with JJ Gertler and Vago Muradian. I'm Laura Winter. Thank you for listening.